Well, thank you. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Maceo Hallmon, and it's an honor for me to be here. I'm going to quickly get into the presentation. I was born here in Frederick. In fact, I was born in this hospital a number of years ago, many years ago. I was speaking to one of my cousins yesterday who was also born here in Frederick. Her name is Shamise, and in fact, she grew up not too far from here. And she told me to start this presentation with a joke. And unfortunately, she had to take another call, and she never got back to me, so she forgot to tell me what the joke should be. So sorry to say I don't have it, okay? But if I'm asked to speak again, I'll make sure I have something, okay? At least I'll write it down. But we'll get right into this. This is quite an honor for me, and I want to say that this information that we're presenting today, and I say we because it has been a collective effort, is recently discovered. The information that we're talking about today has been discovered just in the last 3 to 4 years, unfortunately. But the search started a number of years ago. Back when I was a student at Morgan, a history major, we were given a project, and we were told that we had to do a research project, and all the information that we were to dig up had to be original, primary sources. So I interviewed, at that time, my maternal grandmother, Rachel Johnson, who lived here in Frederick, somebody I was very close to, and she told me the story of my great-grandfather, E. Mitchell Johnson. At that time, which was about 1978, she told me that he started a newspaper. You know, she had the name wrong, but she called it something other than what we have here, but she knew about the paper. She talked about it, and she said, you know, there are no existing copies, but he had a newspaper. He was very active. He was very involved. And so I said, okay, I got to get a copy of this newspaper. So for over 30 years, longer than that, I've been searching for this daggone newspaper. The family heard about it, but we couldn't find it. So just a few years ago, while I was here in the Frederick Library doing some research on a Sunday, long story short, I was connected to Miss Mary Harris here, and she told me about the newspaper, and at that time, we had that great conversation. She said, would you like to see a copy? I dropped the phone. Couldn't believe it. So they were kind enough not only to let me see it, but to allow me to make a copy. And today, what you're looking at is this I believe is the front page, back page, and here are the two other pages to this newspaper. We'll talk more about this paper called the Frederick Hornet. Mr. E. Mitchell Johnson, Edward Mitchell Johnson, was the publisher of this newspaper. We know that it started publication as early as 1902. It survived up until 1915. We also know that this is perhaps the last surviving copy. This document is extremely important. By the way, the Library of Congress has asked to have a copy of this newspaper. They knew about the existence, but they said, we've never seen a copy, so could you send it or give it to us? I don't think the folks here, Arch is going to give it to anyone, but maybe they'll make arrangements to loan it. We'll talk more about it because it is very relevant, and but it's not the story that I'm going to talk about today. It's just a warm-up. Because when I started this search, I was looking for a newspaper. And that's all I was really looking for. But what I found was a lot more. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I just want you to take a minute and read this statement from 1906. This statement, and I'm going to let you read it, and I'll have to read it for you, appears in this newspaper. And I pulled it out because I think it's very relevant. I think it's something that, of course, could be on the front page of a newspaper today. I think it says so much about what this document represents and what its mission was. Here are some of the things that we're going to talk about, who he was. His name was Edward Mitchell Johnson, but I want to tell you that in no case did he use his first name. On an official document that we have, Articles of Incorporation, which we'll talk about in a bit. His scientist name is E. Mitchell Johnson. In fact, the family knew him as Mitchell Johnson. That's how we knew him. We didn't even know his name. We didn't know that name until about 3 or 4 years ago. We're going to talk about his impact, or the impact of his life here in Frederick, Maryland. What was Frederick about, or what did it look like in the early 1900s, and the history lost. Just stepping back a minute, let's talk about Edward Mitchell Johnson, E. Mitchell, or I like to say Mitchell. He was born in Trinidad in 1868. Who else was born in 1868? Whose birthday is today? W.E. Du Bois. Dr. Du Bois was born in 1868. In fact, there's a book back there about Dr. Du Bois. We know that E. Mitchell Johnson came to America on a boat through Baltimore in 1900. His original plan, so I understand, was to dock in New York City. But for reasons we're not sure of, he said, no, I'm not going to New York. I'm getting off here. Got off in Baltimore, went to Washington, D.C. He lived in Washington, D.C. from 1900 to 1902, came to Frederick. We're not sure why he came here, but he came. And we can only imagine the transition, the difference between coming out of the Caribbean, coming to a major city like, out of a major city like Washington, D.C., and coming to Frederick, Maryland in 1902. In 1902, Frederick was very, very different, as you can imagine, right? No telephones, no cell phones, no texting, no TVs, no radios, okay? Okay, none of that, no cars. Major mode of transportation had to be what? Horse and buggy. A different time. And also a different look. The communities at that time were divided primarily along racial lines, clearly defined, okay? Moved here in 1902, he married grandmother Johnson, who we heard so much about as children, a very dynamic person. He was an editor, a reporter, a printer, publisher of several newspapers, and a hatter. I did not know, and I only know this because of the 1910 and 1920 census report. Anybody have any idea what a hatter is, or was, or is? What's a hatter? Somebody makes hats. Didn't know that. Didn't know. Thank you. Didn't know. I could have used you, man.
My people were hatters.
Yeah, okay. Well, we could be related, man. All right. Okay. So we know that he published the Frederick Hornet, along with a newspaper known as the Defender. He was active in Republican politics. Remember, the Republican Party was quite different at that time, and the vast majority of African American people who could vote, did vote, were Republicans. That was true up until about the 1940s, and into the 1950s that started to change, but that was the mold then. He was very active in a number of social organizations, okay? And he was also a father, husband. By the way, we knew about this man here, Mr. Kenneth Johnson, is my grandfather. We did not know about Thomas Randolph until about a year ago, so we didn't know he had a stepson. We also didn't know until about a year ago when he died or where he was buried. Did not know. We now know that he died in 1924, and we discovered, with the help of my colleagues, where he's buried. He, my great-grandmother, my great-aunt, and a great-uncle. It's an unmarked gravesite, and we're going to correct that this year with a ceremony. Here's a photograph. Here's one of his hats. And this is grandmother. We're trying to find out what this pendant is. We have two surviving photographs of him. This is just one. And on both photographs, we see this pin. So it's something, sounds minor, but it sounds like something we want to look into because it may say something about his politics. I believe he's quite a striking man, so quite a guy. Okay, what are we going to talk about? The making of history. And I think this is the piece that was lost to all of us. Something the family had no idea about. what this man really accomplished. Of course, we knew he was an activist. As I said, we knew about the newspaper. And finding the newspaper was great. That was fantastic. We loved the idea of that. But what we also found out about 2 years ago, that we had no idea that this man was the named plaintiff in a case from 1913. This particular case put the city of Frederick on a national map, and we as a family had no idea. So I would like to take the rest of my time to talk more about this story, this lost history. Also like to talk about the gathering of the men, the sacrifice, the plan of action, Edward Johnson and Leo Weinberg. Is anybody familiar with Mr. Leo Weinberg? Anybody here? You familiar with the name? Exactly. That's it. Okay. Well, Mr. Leo Weinberg, young, gifted attorney, died way too young. Attorney with some strong convictions and great talent. Based on my research, this young man was absolutely amazing. He had a photographic memory. I understand that he was so brilliant that when he would argue a case in court, a number of attorneys would actually close their offices down just to hear him present a case. In fact, when he would argue a case down in Annapolis, either in front of the Court of Special Appeals or the Court of Appeals, attorneys from Frederick would actually leave their office, shut down for the day, and go to listen. He could read a document one time, put it off to the side, would never have to make reference to it, never have to check his notes. Said it was awesome. He's also a young man that years prior to his death, he wrote his own obituary. Wrote every line except the last. Okay? But this young man, at age 29, decided to do something that had to put a great deal of pressure on him and his family. Let's take a step backwards. In 1904, the city of Frederick decided that they were going to issue a grandfather clause, which in effect would say, if you're a black man, you can't vote. Up until that time, right after the Civil War, black folks were allowed to vote. At least black men were allowed to vote. Women didn't gain the vote until 1920 in this country, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But in 1904, the city of Frederick, for reasons of its own, decided, hey, look, we're not going to allow black folks to vote anymore, so we're going to adopt the grandfather clause, which basically said that if you couldn't prove that your grandfather voted prior to 1868, you couldn't vote. Well, guess what? That meant black folks couldn't vote. Because who could prove that, right? No one could, especially no one black. And by the way, no new immigrants to this country could vote under this law. But that's what they did. And for a number of years, that was the law of the city until 1913. And in 1913, in May of 1913, 29 African-American men, residents and citizens of this country, residents of Frederick County, decided that enough was enough, that they were going to go vote. At least attempt, which they did do. They went downtown and said, okay, well, we came here to vote. And the city said, no, can't vote, can't do it. So those men came back to the community on All Saints Street and gathered and said, we have to have a plan of action. We have to do something. So roughly 100 black men came together that day, gathered, and decided that they were going to do something they've never done before. And that was they were going to take legal action. This was going to cost some money. And they would cost $110. Now, I know today that's nothing. But in 1913, $110 was a lot of money. And these men went into their pockets and they pulled out and pulled together enough to hire an attorney. Now, just think about this. At that time, they could not have been making more than $4 to $5 a week, if that. So this had to represent at least a quarter of their income, weekly income, at least. But they decided enough was enough. And they said, we're going to make something happen. And they hired Mr. Leo Weinberg. Leo Weinberg was 29 years old at the time. He was known for his talent and his genius. He was an outstanding student in law school and certainly one of the most prominent attorneys, not just in Frederick, but in Western Maryland. But for reasons we haven't discovered yet, he decided he was going to take this case. Keep in mind, he had to be under a lot of pressure. Keep in mind, there weren't a lot of attorneys lining up to take a case like this. But he said, okay, I'll do it. I think it's interesting because it shows that there was collaboration early between the African American community and at least one member of the Jewish community. So I think that's very, very important. So this case was heard in Frederick by a three-judge panel. Three-judge panel. It's a warm day in May. Because keep in mind, they had to, in June, they were actually going to have a general election, so you had to move things along. So they quickly heard this case. The judges heard all the parties, listened to a number of witnesses, including my great-grandfather. When this case was actually heard here in Frederick, every newspaper in the state of Maryland sent a reporter to hear this case. Not just in Maryland, but newspapers out of Washington, D.C., newspapers out of New York, newspapers out of the Midwest. How do we know? Because in doing the research, we found clippings of the outcome of this case all around the country. And this is just one. This is the Afro Ledger from 1913, May of 1913. And you'll see the Afro Ledger, it became later known as the Afro. But at that time, it was known as the Afro Ledger. And here you have the grandfather clause gets what? Stinging blow. That's right. Wow. The judges, all three judges, ruled a unanimous decision that the grandfather clause was ruled unconstitutional. I said earlier there were 29 African American men who went down to register, or at least attempt to register to vote, but were denied. But in this case, there was only one party to the case: Edward Mitchell Johnson. Edward Mitchell Johnson was identified as the named party. We believe that that was because he had an independent source of income. Because you can imagine what would happen if you said, it's enough, okay, it's one thing to add money to it, it's another thing to put your name on it. But he stood up and said, you can use my name, I'll do it. I'll do it for the greater cause. Keep in mind, until a few years ago, the family, his family, my family, had no idea that he was a named plaintiff. We had no idea that this case was a case that he could claim. We should also point out that in 1913, this was really, the grandfather clause was acted all over the country and not ruled unconstitutional until 1915 by the Supreme Court. So you folks here in Frederick were progressive. You were 2 years ahead of the United States Supreme Court. Okay? Didn't think you were progressive, but you were. In fact, the United States Supreme Court didn't even decide to hear the case until October of 1913, didn't make a decision until 1915. Now, as I said earlier, I talked about the fact that a number of newspapers picked this case up. And we have a clipping here from 1913 saying, from May 17, 1913. The case was heard at about, I think, I think it was the 13th of May. And you'll see here it says a Negro who attempted to register had been refused. Well, that Negro was E. Mitchell Johnson. And this is in the New York Times. Interesting, very, very interesting history. Besides being a publisher, he was also an activist. He was in charge of the Emancipation Association. In fact, when he died, he was the last surviving member of the Emancipation Association. You have any idea what they would do, what that was about? Why was such an association even formed here in Frederick? They celebrated they celebrated emancipation. In fact, in Frederick at one time, it was an annual celebration up until 1920, 22. There was a parade started off on I Street and All Saints Street, and the black community would march from there all the way down to the fairgrounds. There would be speakers from all over the country, prominent African-American speakers, people like Dr. Du Bois and others who would come and speak at the fairgrounds to recognize the emancipation. He was also involved in a suffrage league, which really pushed out the vote and advocated the vote. He established the first Boy Scout troop for African-American boys in 1913. The Boy Scouts started in London in 1910, and I understand in my research that on the first day that the troop became operational, there were 50 young African-American boys who were registered to vote. As we pointed out, he published the Frederick Hornet newspaper right here in Frederick. And if you get a chance to take a look at this newspaper, you'll see a copy of the printing press that he probably used. And I read stories where at one time the printing press was actually in his kitchen. And he actually printed the newspaper and would take the wet pages and hang them on a line and let them dry out. And then his sons, 2 of them, would actually go out and sell the newspapers. His newspaper, this particular newspaper, was well known throughout the black community all around the country. And a newspaper out of Washington, D.C. called The Colored American referred to the Frederick Hornet as all wool and a yard wide. That's a term of art that was used. Anybody here have any idea what that means? I didn't make that up. That really is a term. I had to look that up. Any help here? Anybody? Anybody? Okay.
It sounds very respectful and
yes.
It's like they're saying something real good.
Yes. You're good. Right. It is. It's an old English tailor term. It means how they would judge wool, quality wool. That if it was at least a yard wide and wasn't cut up in pieces, right, it was quality, a mark of quality. So that's what they talked about. When they were talking about this newspaper, which was known throughout the country, this newspaper had a reputation of a quality newspaper, something that this community here in Frederick should be very, very proud of. It's a newspaper, when you get a chance, really should try to, if you can get a copy of this, to read it, because it really pushes the whole idea of the community working together, be self-sustaining, racial pride, taking care of itself. This is in the early 1900s, and it's just a powerful, powerful statement. In fact, there's an editorial on the back that criticizes the use of skin bleaching creams. That's right. There were folks selling a product. 90, that's right. 90, they were selling a product that if you used it, apparently it would lighten your skin. Why would anybody want to do that? It's beyond me. And this particular newspaper criticized other African-American newspapers for carrying that advertisement. Early 1900s. Okay? E. Mitchell Johnson also was one of the original founders of the Young Men's Colored Reading Room. And we know that club of Frederick City, which was located on I Street. There's a marker, in fact. You can go to this location and you'll see a marker, and it identifies the men that organized this. Unfortunately, my great-grandfather is not on that marker, and that's something we need to change. And it's only because folks didn't know. We now know, because we have the articles of incorporation, that he and several men signed, and we can see his big bold John Hancock here, E. Mitchell Johnson, so we know he was one of the original founders. So this is something we certainly want to change. This foundation, or this organization, was more than just a reading room. It was really founded to uplift the community. It talked about the need to have people that were well-educated, well-trained, thinkers, doers. That's what this was about establishing. That's what this thing was about, okay? I think that there was another piece that we should point out here, In 1913, there was something else going on in this country. Women did not have the right to vote in this country until 1920, which was sad. It's pretty hard to imagine that women didn't gain that right. But women were organizing across the country and fighting for the right to vote. And in 1913, for the first time, women from around the country came to Washington, D.C. to protest. And within that protest, in the very back, were who? African American women who were fighting and demanding the right to vote as early as 1913, refusing to be left out. So I believe that there is a relationship between these black men coming together in 1913 here in Frederick and saying that enough is enough, and black women and white women going to Washington, D.C., fighting for a right that they would not achieve until 7 years later. Okay? I just come to an end here by saying, and I reuse the term here, all wool and yard wide, because now I'm not talking about the newspaper so much as I'm talking about him. Because I think that he had not just an impact here in Frederick, but around the country. This newspaper had a number of reporters and people that would submit or write articles. And I have a book here by Mr. William Sherrill, the book is on Mr. Bruce Gritt. And Bruce Gritt was a writer for the Frederick Hornet. He would submit articles, send those telegraph those articles in, and they would be published by the newspaper. I know you haven't heard of him. I didn't know anything about him until I started doing the research. And this man right here was a mentor to people like Arthur Schoenberg, people like Marcus Garvey, people like Dr. Du Bois. He was a very, very prominent force within the journalistic community, and he wrote for the Frederick Hornet. The Frederick Hornet, when you read it, it really has a national political impact. It doesn't just talk about the events going on here in Frederick, but it also talks about what's going on a national level. In 1906, for example, there was a major earthquake in San Francisco. This particular newspaper reached out to the black community and said, look, we must organize, we must send money and support out to the victims of that earthquake, 3,000 miles away. So we're talking about a local newspaper answering a national crisis. So I just think it's important for us to take a moment to appreciate what was achieved when these men came together. What they did was absolutely amazing. What the sacrifice they made of raising the money to go out and get an attorney, the commitment for the community to say, look, we've got to vote. Voting is important. Now, we may be a little passé on this, but the folks down in Washington, D.C. decided that they're not going to any longer enforce or back the Voters' Rights Act of 1960, 465? So we're not committed to that anymore. In Baltimore City, less than 30% of the people decide who the mayor is going to be. We have over 350,000 people who are eligible to vote in the city of Baltimore, but only about 70,000 even bother to come out. We're going to have an election in Baltimore, and he or she is going to be elected by less than 20,000 people. Okay? This is having implications. None of this history is really no more than what I would say the future in reverse, in that none of this stuff is over. The fight for the right to vote is not a given. We haven't won. The battle continues. They knew it then. We seem to have lost that. How many people here vote on a regular basis? You don't have to raise your hand, but that's great. Okay? I think it should be mandatory. They made that commitment. And keep in mind, when those men, those 100 black men decided to come up with that money That had to be a commitment, not only by these black men, but by black women. And although all those men couldn't, all 29 couldn't sign up safely as a named plaintiff, they found one person who could, and he did it. And not only did he sign up, he was willing to testify.